So tell us how it came about, because I saw too that it had been on VH1
Right.
at
A
some
different
point.
version of it. This goes back, Jesus, a long time, maybe over a decade. So I'm in Miami. I'm at a spa hotel with my then girlfriend, now wife. And across we're like lounging and everything. And I see Arthur Baker, the record producer who I'd known for years across the.
Oh,
So we
yeah.
started, we sat down, we started drinking and talking, and we both love funk. And even though Arthur is kind of associated with hip hop through Soul Sonic Force and some of those records, like most people who come out of that era, 80s, funk is your foundation of dance music for you as much as disco. And so we started talking. He said, I want to do a doc on funk. And I said, yeah. And he said, Finding the Funk. Oh, cool name.
So good.
The initial idea for the film was for me and Arthur to travel around the country to interview and go to some of the places where funk was created. Because one thing about funk that's very specific, it's a Midwestern creation. Um, Cincinnati, Dayton, Ohio, which we'll talk
Dayton.
about. Um, uh, it's something that really happened in that area and then kind of went both ways because a lot of the bands that you associate with or people like Earth and the Fire that actually started in Chicago with Maurice White. Um,
Mm,
the Ohio Players, again, all along the river, that there was a really
yeah.
interesting
Ohio
thing.
players. It makes sense to me now.
Yeah, there's so many.
That's
There's,
why.
so, there's such a because that area it's not southern, but it's close to the south. But it
Hmm.
also all those people come from industrial cities, which had so they had a certain urban thing,
Yeah.
and very much influenced by blues. Blues, very big part of it, and obviously gospel and soul music, but blues is in there too, and a lot of the guitar
Hmm.
playing and attitude. So we couldn't really get the money, quite honestly, to do what we wanted to do. And somehow VH1 was then doing a lot of rock docs. That was their kind of brand.
Right.
And we got it to them, and they were kind of like, we'll do it if you do, if you do it more. Can you get this guy? And at the time, um, Questlove was just trying to make that transition from drummer to spokesperson, kind of, or personality as he's done. And this is one of the first things I think that one of the early things where remember, he narrates. I remember he told me, I really want to do more of these.
Mm.
And I
Ah.
didn't have a lot of money, but I made a deal with his manager, a guy named Rich Nichols, who died, who was a fantastic guy. So we had him to narrate it, which helped a lot. And then the other thing was, could I get Sly Stone? You know, at that
Fantastic.
at that point in time, and we're talking about 2010, around that time. No, Sly he was the missing link, the Sphinx
Yeah.
Yeah.
of rock pop music. He just was this he come, he go. He hadn't put a record out in years, and I took a fly. I just took a shot, and I'd met his daughter, who's
Hmm.
now on KCRW.
Yeah.
Right.
Lavina Carmel. But at the time she was she was a booker at the Virgil. Remember the Virgil
Yes.
nightclub?
Yep.
So she was a talent booker at the Virgil, and she was DJing.
Amazing.
So I sent her I hit her on Facebook,
Hmm.
and turned out her father, she knew me, who I was, and her father knew who I was, vaguely, I guess. And they said he'd do it, but I had to bring some money. So we negotiated a number that I could live with. And, so this is the great, actually. So we go to Culver City. It's steaming hot. We go to her apartment. We set up our camera. We're like, oh, is he going to show up or not? Right. Um, at one point, she played me a gospel record that he was on when he was 14 years old.
Wow.
Uh, amazing, an amazing, like, oh, so like, his talent was there as an adolescent. So we're coming. Finally, he comes in. Uh, Now I'm telling you, it's like 90 degrees in Culver City. You know how hot that is
Oh yeah.
out there, right?
Oh yeah.
He's got on a, you see in the film, he's got on a jumpsuit
Yeah.
and the wig thing, the blonde wig,
Yeah.
and the cowl hat. I'm like, how can he even move in that thing? So first he wanted some food. I think Novena gave him some Thai food. And then he sat in. And I'm like, as someone who was a journalist in, covering music since really the late 70s when I was in college, Sly had done, I'm thinking 3 interviews that I saw in that era. After his heyday, he was very hard to get a hold of. There's an entire article
Sure.
written about him famously about In Search of Sly.
Yeah.
Mm.
And so here he is. And a few things are really striking about the interview. One is he's very, very funny. Um, and but sometimes you're like, is he being funny or is he? You can't always tell if he's really, really or. But he also has a very strong sense of who he is, despite everything that's happened and all the stuff. He knows he's Sly Stone,
Yeah.
and he's quietly, he was quietly dismissive of, like I asked him about Prince. He goes, "Ah, the little trickster." Everything is
Yeah.
kind of like a little. There's a little thing there, and I don't know if we have it. So you know, he has a very strong sense of his importance. At the same time, he's not. I mean, he's just Sly. And what's interesting is that so we got him. There was definitely a point at which I knew we weren't getting anymore. Like it was done.
Mm.
So I
Mm.
didn't want to try and push him. But it was an amazing. I don't know how long we talked for an hour and change, whatever. But this is one of those guys who helped change music. I mean, when Sly came out, he not only changed sound, he changed the way people dressed.
Yeah.
The Temptations threw away their
Complete.
suits. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. Yeah.
every band that had wore a suit, they were wearing like leather vests by in a year. You know, um, if you listen to those Jackson 5 early records, on Motown, they sound very much the way the vocals are arranged, you can tell the Sly's influence. That's just one example of
Mm.
how massive. And obviously, he was one of the great live performers of all time. At one point, he had the record for most sellouts at Madison Square Garden.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, and also, as you probably
Incredible.
know, he got married on stage at Madison Square Garden.
Yeah, I was gonna say, wasn't he married? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He was married on stage at the Garden. So it was.
Oh my God.
So that was really a profound thing. And what's interesting is that then I found, I'd known George Clinton for years, but he always has a lot of different managers, so it's sometimes hard to figure out. We finally ran him down at a motel, I guess it's kind of a motel in New Jersey, and because he and Sly are just kind of linked because George was so influenced by Sly, and then they collaborated for years, and then they were getting high together for years. Um, yeah, and they got arrested together a number of times. Um, but what's interesting is that unlike Sly, George, he was, he met an incredible young woman because he was really bad. He was really kind of strung out on crack, and she helped him clean him up, quite honestly, and he put weight on. He looks great. He's been
Mm-hmm.
so there was like the two of them on this path. Sly just never was able to never fully came back. Where George was able to get through that dark period and sort of bring himself back into the light, so to speak, on a consistent basis. So that's what's interesting that the two of them and to see to interview them separately and have them talk about each other, knowing how
Yeah.
linked their careers were. Um, and that was also similar. The great thing about interviewing Bootsy Collins is that so we're set up in the hotel room, we're waiting for Bootsy, and you can hear in the other room Bootsy putting himself together. There's clinking. There's all kinds of fabrics moving. You know, because you don't just walk out looking like that. You know what I mean? And he's got a, you know, in the dock, he's got a hat, he's got glasses, he's got all kinds of rings. You know, it's just layers and layers of stuff, and you could hear the process happening in the other room of
So
the
great.
creation of from William Collins becoming Bootsy.
Yeah.
You know, so that was a really great memory. And I would say the other one of the things that really struck me, a great memory was Dayton.
Mm.
So I remember in 1981 when I had my first real job, I worked at Record World magazine, which was Billboard's competition at the time. And somehow I got a bunch of records. There's a band called Dayton. It was a funk band out of Dayton. And I was like, oh, Dayton, Ohio. And then I look, oh, the Ohio Players are from Dayton, Ohio. And Slave is from Dayton, Ohio.
Amazing.
And Junie Morrison's Dayton, Ohio. And it's not that far. Roger and Zappa's from Dayton, Ohio. And it's not that far from Cincinnati. And that's where James Brown was from. So I began putting the pieces together. And I remember doing a piece way back in 81 about Dayton, you know, Dayton as a whole of music as a sort of a center. And I'd always been on my mind. And I kept waiting for someone to really pull that together because it's really quite an interesting story. And finally, I got a chance to go to Dayton. Um, and a few things, you know, were apparent. One is that it used to be it had a big Air Force base at one point. And there was this company called International. There was a big machine company there. Uh, so you had the Air Force generating jobs and money,
Mm-hmm.
and you had this big company that was there. And so everybody in Dayton all had basements. All the guys and girls were in bands, and they had an incredible band culture. So their high school band competition was sort of like the band battles of football teams or basketball teams, where all the high schools and everyone could play. And so all of these guys that we think about, the Ohio Players, Zap, Lakeside, Slave, Roger, there's a bunch of others. They all kind of knew each other or aware of each other from high school. Like the Ohio Players are like they're like the benchmark group. They were the first real big group out of there, and all
Mm-hmm.
the other groups sort of followed in their footsteps. And there were several iterations of obviously of the Ohio Players, but they are like the group that really put Dayton on the map and gave all these bands kind of a center. Um, and the thing about the Ohio Players and funk in general is that you can hear when you hear the lead singer Sugarfoot sing, you can hear you can hear the church and you can hear the blues. You know, it's very very prominent. But they also had a kind of a jazzy thing that they could do. They had great horns, um, and a lot of their tracks are very kind of very. They do a lot of great ballads actually. You know,
I
they're
got to tell you something, Nelson.
yeah.
I bought on eBay a photo album.
Oh,
I didn't mean to. I was looking for pictures of June Christie.
okay.
I was looking for photographs. So what comes up on eBay is this photo album. I get it. It's this young airman from Dayton.
Ah, ah.
I buy it from Dayton. He's stationed in London. He has all these photographs of everybody. He went and took pictures while he was in the service of every jazz artist that came to England. And I'm going to send you those pictures. But it was wild watching this in your documentary and now hearing you talk about it. I mean, I've become really kind of obsessed with him. He's not with us anymore. I started
Huh.
doing his family tree. I started tracing everything, but he was into music forever. You know, he never played. He was just a big fan and he saw everybody. And
Well,
I wish I had
you
his record collection, you know?
you know what else is interesting because one of the bands that started in Dayton was Heatwave, but they actually most of those guys were in the I think they were in the Air Force in Europe.
That's what this guy was. He was
Yeah,
probably
so
there with them.
yeah, so there's a real connection
Yeah.
between the army and the military, which is odd because you think of funk as being very rebellious and very sexy. but there is a kind of a military thread, to it. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Wow, that's
Isn't that
so the book.
crazy?
So you found it on eBay?
I found it on eBay and then I bought it. And then the guy told me I have a second one. And I go, well, I want it. I want to see what, I was just trying to piece them together, like
That's
what's his
amazing.
story? And yeah, yeah. So I started his family tree and everything just because it was just, you know, he became a person to me,
Sure,
not
sure,
just
sure.
like this scrapbook. And I was like, why did anybody let it go? And, why is this not still in the family? And
Ah,
so forth. And so
that's
I
an interesting.
started to find out some of that was that, his child was killed when he was 18 and his only child and so forth,
Oh,
Yeah, but it
wow.
really was so that when I saw that in your movie about Dayton, of course, I went right back to my guy, Alvin Smith. I'm like, oh, Alvin was there, and now that you mentioned the Air Force, I didn't even know about that, that was
Yeah,
part of
yeah.
Dayton too. So
Very,
that makes
very
sense. He was an
strong.
airman.
Yeah. So a lot of what, in fact, you can almost trace the sort of decline of the band scene there. The Air Force Base moved away. I'm thinking probably in the '90s. I think I'll have to check. And
Mm-hmm.
then the bigger company whose name is escaping me, they relocated down south. And so when we got there and the shooting, that you could see like the a lot of the heart
Yeah.
of the town had been ripped out between these two
Right.
things, like a lot of those Midwestern towns, right?
Sure.
Um,
Yeah, I'm from Kentucky, right on the Ohio River.
oh,
And actually, so there was a lot of recording from bands in my town, including a soul band too, that was in the 60s that all recorded for Plato Records, which I think was in Cincinnati. So they
right.
go to Cincinnati and make their records. And then one of the local garage bands, Cut Chemists, like I think he bought all of the masters at Plato because he had all of that stuff and re-released it.
Well, there's something else in why funk happened in that area I think you probably relate to is that there was a ton of colleges in
Yes.
the area. So that was a big part. Sort of remember Animal House is this scene with Otis
Yeah.
Day and the Knights? Well, that all of these bands played on those college circuits. So
There
there's
you go.
Bowling Green and there's a ton of schools
That's
up and through
right.
that whole area. And that kind of helped support the band culture because every weekend the colleges are having a dance.
That's
Yeah.
right.
So that was another. So the
I agree.
geography of the area played a big part in why this happened.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you talked too about the because of that company that was making the stuff for the cars, right? Is that
Right.
the industry that they had like, a sort of, I mean, an income, a steady income,
Yes. So that's why everyone had
almost a
instruments.
middle class kind of,
No, it was definitely a middle
working
class.
class, but
Yeah, yeah,
mm-hmm.
absolutely. One of the guys, a guy named Jared Nickerson, who's now he runs Burnt Sugar Orchestra, Greg Tate's band, the late Greg Tate's band in New York. He's from Dayton, and he would talk at length about just going from house to house, jamming. Guys that carry the instruments down the block and play with these guys or that guys. So it was a very communal, and that's why so many bands. I mean, I made a long list, and there's a ton of bands from this one town, and it's more, considering how small Dayton is,
Yeah.
it's comparable to Motown, it's comparable to Stax in Memphis, comparable to a lot of scenes, except this was very much a band scene. There's a guy named Junie Morrison who came out of there. He's kind of like he's kind of a cult figure, but he was in the Ohio Players in the beginning. But most of the music we think about from that region is band music, and even LA and Babyface are not far from there. They were in Indianapolis,
Oh,
Oh.
and they
interesting.
were in a band too called The Deal.
Oh,
So
cool.
the band that region is very rich, and they do have a hip hop. Excuse me. They do have a funk museum there. I haven't been there since it got going. They
That's
have a music.
cool.
you know, but and they do have like a music walk of fame there. I know the higher players are inducted, but it's a beautiful thing. And I think what's interesting about that is that so you had this band culture,
Yeah.
and you had that in Dayton, and then up and down that region, in the Midwestern region, and then you had this diaspora, where so many of those groups came to LA, and I think that there's kind of Earth and Fire is a really good example. Maurice White is he's a session drummer at Chess Records in Chicago. He plays on like Ramsey Lewis, I'm in the In Crowd. He's on all these great records. He goes to LA with this idea of this band, and over time he develops not just the band itself, which is amazing. He puts together this incredible group of musicians, but this kind of cosmology. You know, if you look at any Earth and Fire album cover, there's images of pyramids on the cover. There's a
Oh,
lot of
yeah.
he's all into pyramids. There's a lot of pyramid stuff. He does this a lot. Um, he was reading a lot. He became a vegetarian. He was he moved to LA in the 70s. So he's a vegetarian. He's into like
Embraced it.
crystals. Yes. And so the
Love it.
band begins to, evolve lyrically. And so they have, songs like, well, Getaway, that's, you can't tell what is going on there. It's like, everything's kind of spacey. There's a song called Jupiter. My name is Jupiter from the galaxy. I came to meet you to make you free. So there's like a lot of like space stuff, uh, mixed in with sort of Egyptology references. Uh, and they had an incredible stage show. They were one of the first bands to use black bands to use Doug Henning. So they would do
Yeah.
things like they'd be on one side of the stage and they'd put things, and then they'd appear over here. Um, so they were, and they also were able to. They had big pop records, but they were very much like that's the way of the world. They were very philosophical, shining star. A little bit of Sly in the sense that they were very, um, elevating consciousness in a good way. And then you had their antithesis, which was P Funk,
Yeah.
which is which were who also created a cosmology. They had, the mothership is right, swing low, sweet chariot, and let me rise. So they had the ship, the mothership landed on stage during their shows. And they were talking to the cosmos. So one thing about funk that's different from, let's say, soul music that came before it. Soul music was very Christian, even though it was very secular, but also Christian. There was a kind of very strong gospel thread, right?
Mm-hmm.
This was a lot of the funk music, both in the clothing and in the songs, suggested some kind of higher consciousness and connection to space. You know, there was a
Fascinating.
very high sense. So it was very much about non-Christian ideas about space. Whether it's Earth and Fire, who are into Egyptology, or P Funk, which is sort of like this kind of psychedelic hippie drug thing. You know, it was about raising up. It was about raising up into this other point of view, and a lot of them were very influenced by Sun Ra.
Yeah.
All right.
It's very even though his music, Sun Ra was like more out than they were. They
Yeah.
definitely, if you ever saw a Sun Ra show, there are elements both in the staging of his shows and the way he arranged music, and that you can see are in both those bands, because George Clinton and Maurice White were both guys who were big readers and obviously listened to Sun Ra. So I always think Sun Ra is the undercover funkster.
Yes.
Yeah,
I
because
like
he was
that.
so influential. Though he's musically, you would not necessarily put that. You can see that in terms of expanding the mind
Mm.
expansion. He was there. So uh, I think that's a really interesting thread. And there's so much jazz funk. That because we look at a band like Kool and the Gang, from New Jersey.
Oh,
Their
right.
early albums are like they have big funk records. They have Hollywood Swingin'. They have,
Of course.
but they have like really amazing kind of spacey. You get high and lean your head back music. And so there was a definite throughout, and maybe that's just a reflection of the era. There was this late 60s into mid 70s, which is one of the classic eras of funk. It's very there's a lot of like
Exactly.
you know.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
but at the same time, the other thing that really I think we tried to hit on in the film was the transition from band music where you had, three or four horns, you had a Latin percussion player, you might have two guitar players, two keyboard players, sometimes two or three lead singers, background singers. As the technology, when Stevie Wonder comes in and he does those albums of Fulfilling His First Finale and Intervisions using Moog synthesizers, that really radically began to affect the sound.
Yeah.
So people like Herbie Hancock are making funk records.
Yeah.
George Duke, another guy who came out of jazz, is making funk records, and they're making keyboard-based funk records. As the decade goes on, the Linn drum comes in, and a bunch of other drum machines, the DMX drum machine, and this thing begins to shift. And so you see the bands. Earth and Fire used to have 11 guys. Now they have 3.
Yeah.
Cheaper that
Cameo,
way.
yeah. Oh, that's part of it. Cameo was another band out of New York, is in Atlanta,
Cameo.
had 12 guys. Now they have 3.
Yeah.
Great.
So it was the technology allowed the Maurice Whites and the George Clintons to shift, but it also empowered a lot of people, to get into the game who couldn't have afforded a big band. Cameo is really interesting because they were one of the better bands to make the transition from this era. So they were like a big raunchy funk band. They had songs like "Shake Your Pants, Shake Your Pants." It was really, party music. And then they really figured out how to make these kind of uh, Word Up, these records that were kind of huge, but they were they still had funk, but they had a much more technological sound and a much more metallic sound, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, so that's one of the things that we tried to really chronicle in the film. This transition that happened with the technology and how it both was embraced, but also, it put some people out of business
Yeah.
because
Well,
they didn't need as many musicians.
I love seeing that transition. I mean, even just Vernon Reid talking about the wah pedal and the clavinet.
Right, right.
And when I, envision both of those, and he points it out so perfectly when he says Stevie Wonder, and you go, oh yeah, the clavinet,
Yeah.
I of course did my thing after watching the movie of like the wah pedal. When did that start? Who first used it? I was like, could it be that it was just Jimi Hendrix? And it really was just Jimi Hendrix who
Yeah.
got the
Yeah.
wah pedal huge
Amazing.
part of rock, which I think is amazing, that totally got used in funk. Like it went from rock, and it was actually just a small amount of people that were using it in rock in the late 60s. It was Jimmy and like Eric Clapton
Right.
and
Yeah,
like
no
not
Beatles,
very
no
many other.
Stones.
I mean, yeah, no Beatles, no Stones. In fact, I don't. Yeah, I guess like Stones mid 70s start using a wah pedal. But yeah, I mean, it was interesting to see that in your movie about how they were picking up on all the new shit that was coming out, all the new gear, like George Clinton talking about more bounce to the ounce,
Yeah,
or
that great one.
Laurel talking about Flashlight and him playing everything pretty much on the synthesizers. Because if you think about Flashlight, the guitar is just the same thing. It's
Right.
all the keyboards. So I found that really fascinating in your doc.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because in Tume, when he talks about juicy fruit,
Yeah.
and he makes a big point about the phrase. He uses the phrase quantize, which is that instead of just looping the beat, he played it on the drum machine, and it's interesting about that beat because it's one of the most influential and most sampled records of all time, and it's one of the only ones that I know of where the musicians actually still sort of played the technology. And I
Yeah.
wonder all the time if that's one of the reasons why it has such there's a breath in it, he says, that we're feeling. And I do think that one of the technology sometimes has been playing the musicians in some respects, right? Um,
Yeah.
and that's a great example of it. Not you said something really interesting about rock, and I would make a case that that Led Zeppelin was a funk band.
I like it. Let's hear it.
Well, yeah, let's hear it. I mean,
Well,
you've
listen,
got me going now. I'm like, oh, the blues, the drums.
yeah, listen to when the levees was it the levees fall?
Uh-huh.
Heavy breaks. Yep.
Break levees? Yo, that's the reason why it's sampled by rappers. That's funky as hell.
That
Um,
Bonham beat.
oh yeah, and then what's the other? Oh, there's a couple of other. Dun, 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 I'm
Oh
just
yeah.
talking about love. Dun, dun, dun,
Yeah,
dun,
I
dun,
know
dun.
what you're talking about.
Oh,
Um,
there's
is it
that's a funky
trampled
record.
underfoot? Is it that
Yes,
one?
that's a funky ass record.
Yeah.
When I started listening to Led Zepp, I'll tell you a great story. I lived in a black neighborhood, and then we moved into a white neighborhood when I was about 14. So I'm trying to hang out with the white guys, and they invite me over to their. This guy invites me to his room, and he plays Led Zeppelin, the Physical Graffiti album,
Mm-hmm.
and I've never smoked hashish, so we're smoking hash. He's got quad speakers, so he's got a speaker in every corner of the room,
Yeah.
and he plays Kashmir. Da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da.
Uh-huh.
Oh, I'm tripping. I'm tripping. And but to me, that's a funk record.
I could
And I
see
think
it.
John Bonham,
Yeah.
there's a reason why John Bonham is sampled so much. He's got a great foot.
It's
I mean,
true.
the way he mic'd his snare drum was insane.
Yeah.
And his sense of in the pocket.
Mm,
There's a kind of like
That's
he's
yeah.
not.
that's what's in that song. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And I don't know music in that way, but that's it.
Yeah, so
One.
I was
It's the one. As in
yeah,
your movie. The one.
exactly the one. So I always I thought, and that's one reason when Zeppelin was one of the bands that got sampled a lot. You mean that, I think Mike D doesn't talk about it in the film, but the Beastie Boys I think they sampled it a few times.
Yeah.
So that's the thing about, I think a lot of what happened in that era, unfortunately, was musical apartheid, right?
Mm,
It was very hard for rock stations, or hard, not hard, they could have, but they didn't want to play. Basically, they played Hendrix and almost no other black artists.
Mm,
right.
Maybe Sly might slip in there, but it was basically Hendrix. Once they got the idea of album-oriented rock, that AOR rock they used to call it.
yeah.
And I always would hear, well, this band is doing this, and this band, I can listen to Zepp. I can listen to a bunch of the metal bands, some of the quote unquote rock bands. There's Bad Company records that could have played. You know what I mean? Um, and then at the same time, so I think that there was a barrier, somewhat artificial, between what was going on in quote unquote funk, but was very, I mean, rock influence. So when Hendrix does Band of Gypsies, it's a funk album.
Yeah.
It's a funk
Oh
blues album, really.
yeah.
It's a funk blues album. And if Jimmy had lived, who knows? Perhaps it would have been really interesting because he definitely would have ended up collaborating with a lot of these other guys.
I was thinking that after watching your film, I was like, if he had
Oh,
lived, because he really was the first person to use the wah pedal. It literally came out in 1967. He used it in 1967. So, and Frank Zappa
incredible.
gave it to him.
That's wild.
So I was thinking like, oh God, if he had lived longer, longer than those 3 years.
Yeah.
How would he have collaborated with these guys, and how would his music evolve? I mean, it could have really created its own thing. I mean, he could have fallen in a funk thing, or it could have just taken off in so many different directions. But I thought about him and Sly and George Clinton and all those guys and what it would have been like. Been amazing.
Think about this,
Amazing.
if you listen to a Parliament Funkadelic, when it was all about Mike Hampton doing Cosmic Slop, and all the guitars on any P Funk record are Hendrix.
Yeah.
The Isley Brothers, Ernie Isley made a whole career basically doing Hendrix licks. So his spirit was in funk.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Once he did Band of Gypsies,
true.
it was like, oh, we had that. Yeah.
That's it, right? With Buddy Miles and all of that, and that collaboration.
Because Buddy Miles, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I always think, wonder what, how he made that shift, to get rid of the, Noel and Mitch,
Yeah.
and just decide he was going to change the band. And why did he do that? But obviously that kind of music would not have, that was going to go. That psychedelic period was so short.
Right.
That was going. And he just foresaw it. It just is kind of amazing.
He was an R&B guy.
Yeah.
There's amazing pictures of him with like Little Richard, with Wilson Pickett.
Yes.
So he knew what that was. I think one of the things that's really interesting is Bootsy says about Hendrix, and that he was a side guy, and all the R&B guys knew him, like, because he was a guy who was on the circuit, right? Yeah. He goes to England, he comes back with all crazy clothes. Yeah, Jimmy. He goes to England, and suddenly he's got like, crazy clothes and crazy hair. But they all saw he's a guy who was a background guy, who's now a front guy. Mm. So that's Bootsy going from James Brown to Bootsy. That's
of course
Roger going from Zapp and becoming. You began seeing the guys who were. The relationship in Black music had been there's a lead singer or lead singers, and there's a band. Funk is then in many ways the children of Hendrix, in that no, the guys who play instruments are in the front. Now it's the singers.
That's
and that was a big.
I never thought of that. I never made that connection. That's really interesting.
And Hendrix had a lot to do with that because he was one of them.
Yeah.
They knew him from like, oh, that's Jimmy with the processed hair.
He doesn't process it anymore.
Exactly. So I just thought that. So he's kind of a big. I mean, he's a big figure in so many ways. But if you remember the band he had at Woodstock, if you watch all the Woodstock footage, he's got percussion players with him. He's got some Afro-Cuban kind of thing going on. So he definitely was like, okay, I've done all I can with 2 instruments behind me.
Yeah. Gotcha.
If I have more pieces, I can explore more directions. And I think that was, but I think all of these bands in a way are, I particularly think about the P-Funk and the Isley Brothers and some who were very like, yo, we like what he's doing. We're going to take this one song and we're going to make a whole style out of one direction that Jimmy was in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah. You see it so much, and you put it so well in your documentary as a through line from Jimmy to P-Funk, like you can see it so clearly in your movie, and yeah, it's cool.
Love it.
Yeah, I gotta shout out a guy who's central to the doc and has been central to my journey in music. Is a guy named Alan Leeds, who's in the film. So Alan is one of the most remarkable careers of anybody in music. He was a white DJ on a Black station in Newport in Virginia in the 60s.
Yeah.
He meets James Brown. James Brown likes him. James Brown basically hires him to be part of his road touring team.
Okay.
He becomes road manager. He travels around with Brown. He also works with Ray Charles. He works with a bunch of giants. And then he gets to work for a while. He works with, I think he did a little bit with P Funk, but then he meets Prince.
Yeah.
And he was a road manager for Prince. He's actually got a line in Purple Rain. 5 minutes. And he and his wife both worked for Prince during the, from, all during the glory days of controversy, all through Purple Rain and through. And then Alan ended up, in fact, running Paisley Park Records for a while.
Wow.
And then it's kind of toward his later iteration, he ends up being manager of D'Angelo.
I love D'Angelo in your movie, by the way.
Oh yeah, he's great.
He's so good.
So good.
So great. So smart.
Love him.
Yeah. Oh, he knows his shit backwards and
Oh
forwards.
my God. So smart.
So Alan sort of was my through line, because very few people have. So he was with Brown during the creation of funk. He's with Prince when he's sort of creating his version of keyboard-driven funk.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's with D'Angelo, who's trying to figure out another way to approach the backbeat, And I thought that so he was one, he wrote a book on James Brown that I recommend to everyone. It's called There Was a Time. And he's just really one of the most knowledgeable people I know about this music and the culture around it. So it was really great to highlight him in the doc.
He was great. He was great listening to him talk about Prince. And then, having seen that he worked with James Brown, you're like, whoa.
So good.
He is it's funny. There's this white guy from Virginia. And actually, he's not from Virginia, he's from New York area. But he's lived very much connected to the culture. And he's one of my favorite people to talk to, because he's heard everything. And he's got his basement, he's got like every James Brown record ever made. I mean, like, he's got all kinds of tour paraphernalia from Prince. If his house burnt down,
oh my God,
a lot of history would go with it. He's just phenomenal.
And where do you find it today? Where do you find it today in music, Nelson?
Well, it's funny. When we were doing the film, one of the things that really popped up were jam bands. And that a lot of the jam bands, if you listen the way, because they play these, there's this kind of Grateful Dead meets P-Funk kind of thing that they're doing, because a lot of the bass players are very prominent in those groups, because they're doing instrumental jams, and so it reminds me. I find it a bit surprisingly in some of those groups, actually. But again, it's not surprising, because it's about music, and musicians will take wherever they can from. I do hear a lot of stuff on now I have to go. You can't really find it on the radio necessarily. So, but I hear in clubs, I hear in boutiques, I'm hearing a lot of keyboard kind of funk records that were like that. They're kind of like 80s, what they called electro boogie. That was a phrase that came up. It's kind of like I don't know. That's a good example. I mean, even this is gonna sound weird, but even some of the stuff that's on a who's the guy, the good looking guy, the good looking British guy who was on who's in the boy group that all the girls love now?
Harry Styles.
Yeah,
Harry Styles.
There's some tracks on his album where he's dipping into that thing. So it used to be the funk came through the bass and guitar and drum interplay. Now it's about how you arrange your drum programs and what kind of keyboard loops you create.
Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
And
now,
so
I would argue that jam bands, I'm not sure about their funky side, because a lot of the times the thing that drives me crazy about jam bands, there is no one.
Yeah. They're not. I'm not saying that.
all over the place. I'm like, where the fuck is the beat? This is driving me insane.
They're wander. I was gonna say, the band Galactic out of New Orleans.
No, they sound intriguing though.
Yeah, they're a group from New Orleans that who are funky and they're good. There's where else you find funk, and we tapped into it a bit in the film, is these sort of horn groups, these groups from New Orleans, these and also you see them like there's a whole circuit where they're playing behind rappers now.
Yeah. Right. Oh,
There's
that's interesting.
There's a spot called Brooklyn Bowl here in New York, and a lot of them will play there or Blue Note. We don't have Rakim or who's the guys or some of the guys in the Wu Tang. It's not unusual to see these collabos between these horn driven New Orleans based bands and MCs. And I think, wow, that's an interesting collection about funk. But I think that funk is in a lot of stuff that's not obvious, but it's a part of the pulse. A lot of the dance music that you hear now that's coming out of Europe and even some of the pop, quote unquote, pop girls.
Yeah.
I mean, I would not Taylor Swift, but
right.
some of the like some of Dua Lipa's records.
Dua Lipa, yeah. There
She's
you
definitely
go.
Accessing it. So it's not so much anymore announcing I'm a funk person, but it's there and they're using the tool. And let's be frank, I mean, we didn't mention Bruno Mars, of course.
Yes.
Bruno Mars is absolutely, and if you go see Bruno Mars live, he's great live.
I'll bet.
He's great, and he's got a great, and it's also interesting because he's as much a musician as he is a singer. So the horn guys on stage, they're dancing up front with him. He will play instruments with them. Anderson .Paak, similarly, with his band. Those two guys actually, in their own way, have embodied a lot of funk, and they've obviously managed to do it in a contemporary way. I think both of them, their records are always interesting. Obviously, Bruno's. What do you say?
Steve Lacy.
Steve Lacy.
Oh yeah, we love him.
And that band, and the band, the Internet.
Yes, love that band.
Yeah, so there's people out there doing it, but I think that aside from Uptown Funk, which was obviously a funk record, most of the time the funk is now part of the mix of how people arrange music. Because I find so much dance music, or quote unquote, I don't know what we're calling it now, the new phrases, but a lot of it is, I hear the funk and all up in it.
I love it. I love that.
It's just not announced as we're doing a funk record. But yeah, the way we're arranging these keyboards here, the way we have this drum machine program, it's coming right out of a funk tradition.
Yeah.
That's so great.
I'm still waiting for another Sly to come around though.
That ain't gonna happen.
He's I mean, him talking about him recording on his wedding night or his honeymoon.
Yeah.
And like you saying your wife must have not liked that. No.
That was after telling that.
Just the way that he was so fucking obsessed and dedicated, and him talking about the drum machines and he's so like sincere when you're interviewing him. Like it's not like he's making a big deal of himself or anything, and he's just a genius. It's just
he's a sincere obsessive. It's sincere obsessive. I don't know. Is the story in there about that Mtume tells about Sly in his basement in the film, the latest version? Do you remember that story?
I don't recall that.
Okay. But there's a lot of stuff that didn't make it. I mean, we did a storyteller version. There's still tons more. But at one point, I'll leave you with this. When Sly was not really doing well, someone who knew Mtume calls him up and says, Sly's looking for a place to stay. So Mtume, who's now passed, but he had Sly live in his basement for about 6 months. This is probably in the 90s, I think.
Oh my God.
And What Mtume would say is that I would open the door and there's music going on. He was constantly making music. He didn't necessarily release it to people. He wouldn't necessarily play it for everybody, but he was always making music.
And just such a wonderful producer too. It's just like unbelievable. Like those Beau Brummels records are like nothing else was like that at the time. It was
Yeah, that's a
completely
great
unique.
reference. People forget that he sort of refined a lot of what he did with Sly and the Family Stone later as a producer,
Yeah.
producing quote unquote pop bands, but seeing the place where this is where gospel meets this kind of melody with these kind of keyboards. No one, maybe the Beatles, but even them, no one mixed black music traditions and quote unquote pop music
Yeah.
traditions and was able to create as much of a synthesis. Everyday
Beautiful.
people, beautiful record. Anybody's a
Mm-hmm.
star. These are fantastic, uplifting records
Yeah.
that
So you caught me
and then
smiling again. And,
oh yeah.
just so many, it just makes you happy. Just really
You want
make
me to
you
say
happy, these songs.
if you so because we're almost through, I'll just say this. I saw Sly play one show in New York about 15 years ago now. He didn't make it through the whole show, believe me.
Uh,
But he did If You Want Me to Stay
Yeah.
live. Magic. So I got to taste a little bit of the flavor and it was amazing.